4 aircraft never made it to the target. 8 men died in the desert. The hostages stayed in captivity, and the failure exposed everything broken inside the most powerful military on Earth. This is what happens when a nation sends its best men into a mission the institution behind them was never built to run. On November 4, 1979, Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran and took 66 Americans hostage. Ayatollah Khomeini backed the seizure publicly. 14 were released in the weeks that followed. 52 remained. Months of diplomacy failed. Carter approved a rescue mission. The plan required inserting an assault force more than 1,000 miles into Iranian territory, reaching the heart of Tehran, breaching a fortified embassy compound, and extracting 53 Americans, without Iranian air defenses detecting a single aircraft. It would unfold across 2 nights. It had never been rehearsed as a complete sequence, and it was built on a minimum that left no room for anything to go wrong. The assault element was Delta Force, barely 2 years past full activation. Its commander was Colonel Charlie Beckwith. Above him, Major General James Vaught controlled the Joint Task Force. No single officer held authority over every component: air, ground, logistics, support. Each service branch ran its own piece through its own chain of command. The operation was designed in stages. 6 C-130 aircraft would fly from Masira Island in Oman and land at a remote stretch of desert in central Iran, 300 miles southeast of Tehran, a site the planners called Desert 1. 8 helicopters would lift off the USS Nimitz in the Gulf of Oman, fly low across Iran at night, and rendezvous there. Delta Force would transfer to the helicopters, refuel, and move to a second hide site in the mountains northeast of Tehran. They would spend the following day concealed. That night, Iranian agents with trucks would move them into the city. The assault on the embassy would happen after dark. The hostages would be extracted by helicopter to a seized airfield called Manzarieh, where C-141 transport aircraft would fly them out of Iran. Every stage had to work in sequence on schedule without margin. The operation launched the night of April 24, 1980. 6 C-130s crossed into Iranian airspace from Oman. 8 helicopters lifted off the Nimitz. The 2 elements were to meet in the desert, refuel, and push toward Tehran together. In Washington, Jimmy Carter sat in the Situation Room and waited. His presidency had been defined by the hostage crisis for 5 months. Every diplomatic channel had closed. Every negotiation had stalled. He had authorized the mission knowing that failure would be visible to the entire world. He waited for updates that might not come in time to matter. The helicopters chosen for the mission had never been built for it. They were mine-sweeping aircraft, converted and crewed by Navy aviators, with no specialized training for this kind of work. The plan required a minimum of 6 to reach Desert 1 operational. 8 were sent. 2 could fail, and the mission would still go forward. That was the entire margin. En route, the formation flew into a haboob, a dense desert sandstorm, near zero visibility, navigation systems failing in the storm. The crews had not been warned it was there. Then one helicopter detected a cracked rotor blade and landed in the desert. 1 down. Then another lost navigation capability and turned back to the carrier. 2 down. Then a third reported hydraulic warning indicators and aborted. 3 down. The official inquiry later assessed that aircraft as potentially flyable. The pilot may have misread the gauges. 3 of 8 gone. 5 reached Desert 1, late, behind the timeline the mission depended on. Then, on the ground, one of the 5 was found to have a real hydraulic failure. It wasn't going anywhere. 4 helicopters. The mission floor was 6. Beckwith called it, Vaught concurred. Carter approved the abort from Washington. At approximately 2:30 in the morning on April 25th, Eagle Claw was over. It was over. Before the rescue ever began, during repositioning for extraction, one of the remaining helicopters drifted into the rotor wash of a C-130 tanker sitting on the ground. The rotor struck the fuselage, fuel ignited. Both aircraft caught fire. In seconds, the desert was burning. 8 Americans died, 5 Air Force crew aboard the C-130, 3 Marines aboard the helicopter. 4 others pulled out with severe burns. The surviving crews boarded the remaining C-130s and left in darkness. The helicopters stayed, burning in the Iranian desert, loaded with classified documents, agent lists, and safe house locations. The identities of Iranian nationals who had agreed to assist the mission. The CIA arrangements inside Tehran. The full operational architecture of the rescue, left behind on the desert floor. Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces reached the site within hours. They photographed the wreckage. They recovered the documents. The bodies of the 8 Americans went on display for international media. The images went around the world before Carter had finished drafting his statement. He addressed the nation the following morning and took full responsibility. The pictures had already done the damage. If you want to understand the operations that changed how America fights, subscribe. This is what we cover. The Holloway Commission delivered its findings 4 months later. Not a mission destroyed by misfortune. A mission built without the capacity to survive what went wrong. And what went wrong was foreseeable. 4 reasons Eagle Claw failed. No unified command. The Army ran Delta Force. The Navy ran the helicopters. The Air Force ran the transports. No single officer controlled all of it. When decisions had to cross those seams, the structure didn't hold. Wrong aircraft. The helicopters were capable at what they were designed for. This wasn't that. Long-range infiltration at low altitude in hostile airspace at night demands specific training, specific equipment, and a culture built entirely around that mission. None of that existed inside the U.S. military in April 1980. Minimal redundancy. The Commission recommended launching with no fewer than 10 helicopters. 8 were sent. The planners had calculated the minimum. They hadn't calculated what happened when the operation arrived at it. No full rehearsal. Every component trained in isolation. The complete sequence, all elements together, under realistic conditions, was never run before the night it had to work. The seams between units had never been tested. On April 24th, they were tested once. Each of these failures had been visible during planning. Officers involved later said concerns had been raised about the helicopter numbers, about the lack of joint training, about the command structure. Those concerns were weighed against the pressure to act and against the operational security reasoning that kept the planning group deliberately small. Fewer people knowing meant a safer mission. The logic went. What that logic produced was a planning process with no real stress testing, no outside perspective, and no way to surface the gaps between what each component assumed and what the others could actually deliver. The institutional response took years and met resistance at every step. Each service branch had spent decades building its own culture, its own procurement relationships, its own chain of command. The Army did not want the Navy shaping how its forces operated. The Navy did not want Army doctrine applied to how it flew. The Air Force had its own congressional relationships, its own budget priorities, its own view of what special operations required. A unified command cutting across all of that was, from each branch's perspective, a threat. Each found reasons why it was premature, unnecessary, or structurally flawed. They lost that argument. The 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, stood up in 1981, built specifically around the mission that had broken Eagle Claw, long-range, low-altitude at night in denied airspace. Their aircraft were maintained for that environment. Their crews trained for nothing else. Joint Special Operations Command gave Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 the unified structure the April mission had been missing. And in 1987, Congress created United States Special Operations Command over the active resistance of the Joint Chiefs, because after 7 years, the military had not fixed itself voluntarily. The hostages came home on January 20th, 1981, 444 days after they were taken, the same day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. The Algiers Accords, brokered through diplomatic back channels, produced what military force had not. Carter had authorized Eagle Claw in April. The hostages came home 9 months later on the first day of someone else's presidency. The 8 men who died at Desert One are not widely remembered outside the communities that served with them. Staff Sergeant Dewey Johnson was 22. Sergeant John Harvey was 21. Corporal George Holmes was 19. Captains Richard Baca, Harold Lewis, Lynn McIntosh, and Charles McMillan were career Air Force officers who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of mission. Technical Sergeant Joel Mayo had been selected for the operation because of his experience. They died before the mission reached its target, during an abort, in a collision no one had planned for, in a desert most Americans have never heard of. The Night Stalkers, who flew into Abbottabad in May 2011, flew aircraft built in direct response to what failed at Desert 1. They trained under doctrine that Eagle Claw's wreckage had written. They operated under a command structure that didn't exist before April 25, 1980. Every decision made in the years after Eagle Claw, every dollar spent on specialized aviation, every joint training exercise, every piece of legislation that forced the branches to function as a unified force was present in that compound in Pakistan in some form. Abbottabad lasted 38 minutes. It began in a burning desert 31 years earlier.